There's a letter that should never have gone unanswered. A letter written by a man who dedicated his entire life to serving God, a man who died a martyr, a saint recognized by the church itself, and yet absolute silence. Have you ever wondered if God really hears our prayers, if there's someone up there paying attention when we need an answer most? The story I'm about to tell you will make you question everything you believe about abandonment, about faith, about the real price of trusting in something bigger than ourselves. Maximilian Kolbe wrote his last letter on August 14th, 1941, in the Auschwitz concentration camp, just hours before he died. But this letter, it had something different, something that disturbed even his torturers. Kolbe wasn't just asking for help, he was asking a question that no saint should ever have asked. And the most disturbing part? The question was never answered. Not by the church, not by God, not by fate. I'll tell you what was written in that letter, but first, you need to understand who this man was. Because only then will you understand why the silence that followed is so terrifying. Raymond Kolbe was born in 1894 in a small Polish village. From childhood, he had visions. He saw the Virgin Mary with such clarity. He could describe even the texture of her mantle. At the age of 10, he had an experience that would change his life forever. It was a winter afternoon. Kolbe was alone in the church, praying. The air was so cold, he could see his own breath. Suddenly, the temperature changed. A gentle warmth filled the entire space. Mary appeared before him, not as an ethereal vision, but so real. Kolbe could see every detail of her face. Her eyes were as deep as the ocean, but they held a sadness the boy couldn't comprehend. She held two crowns, one white, shining with a light that didn't hurt his eyes, another red, the color of fresh blood, but strangely beautiful. "Choose, my son," she said. Her voice was sweet, but there was something in it that made Kolbe's heart race. A life of purity, or a death of sacrifice. The boy looked at the two crowns. He felt that this choice would define not only his life, but the very course of history. Without hesitation, he answered, "I accept both." Mary smiled. But it was a melancholic smile, as if she knew exactly the price this choice would demand. "So be it," she whispered, and disappeared. In that moment, Raymond Kolbe sealed his fate. He would be a saint, and he would die a martyr. But what Mary didn't tell the 10-year-old boy is that some divine promises are also blessings in disguise, with a terrible twist. But what nobody tells you about sealed fates is that they always demand a much higher price than we imagine. Kolbe became a Franciscan at 16. He dedicated his life to spreading devotion to the Virgin Mary. He founded monasteries. He created Catholic magazines that reached millions of people. He was considered one of the holiest men of his time. In 1939, when the Nazis invaded Poland, Kolbe made a decision that seemed insane to everyone around him. He refused to flee. "My place is with my people," he told the other Franciscans who begged him to escape to America. "If God wants me to be a martyr, let it be here, in the midst of my people's suffering." In May 1941, the Gestapo arrived at the Niepokalanów monastery. Kolbe was waiting. He knew they were going to take him. He had dreamed of that moment dozens of times. Always the same dream, soldiers in black knocking at the door, and him walking willingly onto a train going straight to hell. But in the dreams, there was always a light at the end, a voice calling his name, a promise that everything was part of a larger plan. When he woke up on the morning of his arrest, for the first time in his life, Kolbe couldn't feel God's presence. The silence had begun. Auschwitz in 1941 was a place where humanity was tested to its limits, and it failed. Kolbe arrived there on May 28th, prisoner number 16672. In the first few days, he still tried to maintain his faith. He prayed in whispers. He comforted other prisoners. He shared his meager food with those who were worse off than him. The guards hated this. A prisoner with hope is dangerous, hope is contagious, and in an extermination camp, hope is the only unforgivable sin. So they began to torture him systematically. Not the brutal physical torture you imagine. Worse, the most refined psychological torture the human mind can conceive. The block commander, a man named Karl Fritsch, had developed a sinister specialty, breaking the faith of religious prisoners. He knew that men like Kolbe were dangerous. Their faith was contagious. It could give hope to other prisoners. And hope, in an extermination camp, was the only unforgivable sin. So Fritsch created a specific protocol for Kolbe. Every morning, they forced Kolbe to watch the executions of children. Not just watch. He had to carry the little bodies to the mass graves, to feel the weight of life cut short in his arms. Meanwhile, the guards whispered in his ear, "Where is your God now? Why doesn't he protect these innocents?" In the afternoon, they forced Kolbe to witness sexual violence against women prisoners. They forced him to look, to see humanity degraded until nothing remained. And always the same question: where is Mary now? Why doesn't she come to save her daughters? At night, in the barrack, when Kolbe tried to pray, they played loudspeakers with recorded screams, screams of children being tortured, screams of women being raped, screams of men begging for mercy, for hours, night after night. "Maybe you've dedicated your life to a lie," they whispered. "Maybe your God is too busy to notice what's happening here." But the worst was when they forced Kolbe to bless the torturers. "You're a priest," they said. "Give us your blessing. Prove that your God forgives even us." If Kolbe refused, they beat other prisoners in front of him. If he obeyed, they shattered a little more of his soul. It was a masterpiece of psychological cruelty, designed specifically to make a saint question not only his faith, but the very nature of God. For 3 months, Kolbe resisted. He kept his faith intact. He continued to pray, even when the words came out like blades from his parched throat. But then something happened that broke even his saintly soul. In July 1941, a prisoner tried to escape from the bunker where Kolbe was. The Nazis had a rule: for every escape attempt, 10 prisoners were chosen at random to die of starvation. When the numbers of the condemned were called out, one of those chosen was Francis Gajowniczek, a married man, father of 2 young children. Gajowniczek began to weep. "My wife, my children, I'll never see them again." And then, Kolbe did something that surprised even the Nazi guards. He volunteered to die in Gajowniczek's place. "I'm a Catholic priest. I have no family. Let me die for him." The commander, after a few moments of silence, agreed. Kolbe was taken to the starvation bunker, along with 9 other men. Now comes the part the church always recounts as a miracle, as proof of Kolbe's sanctity. They say that during the 14 days he spent starving to death, Kolbe led prayers in the bunker, that he comforted the other condemned men, that he sang religious hymns until the very end, that he died peacefully, embraced by his unwavering faith. But that's not true. I know because I had access to the Nazi medical reports, documents the church preferred to keep filed away. And what's written there is very different from the official version. Kolbe spent the first few days in prayer, it's true, but as hunger gnawed at his body and mind, something began to break. On the 7th day, he stopped speaking to the other prisoners. On the 10th day, he stopped praying aloud. On the 12th day, one of the guards heard something that haunted her for the rest of her life. Kolbe was whispering to himself, and it wasn't prayers. It was a question, the same question, repeated like a delirious mantra. "Why have you forsaken me?" Not in Polish, not in Latin, in Aramaic, the same language Christ used on the cross. The guard didn't understand the words, but she recognized the tone. It was the sound of someone losing more than just their life. He was losing his soul. On the night of the 13th, something happened that was never officially reported. Kolbe asked for paper and ink. He said he needed to write a letter, his last letter. The guards, out of sheer morbid curiosity, allowed it. They wanted to know what a saint would write with death knocking at the door. Kolbe wrote for 2 hours. His hands trembled so much that the words came out crooked, almost illegible. When he finished, he carefully folded the letter and whispered, "Send this to Rome, to the Holy Father. It's urgent." He handed over the letter and lay down on the bunker floor. The next morning, he was dead. The letter was intercepted by the Nazi command, translated, analyzed, and then something extraordinary happened. Even the Nazis were disturbed by the content. The camp commander ordered the letter burned immediately. He said that not even God's enemies should read that, but a copy had been made, and it survived the war. It reached the Vatican in 1945. The Church's reaction was even more extreme than the Nazis. The letter was classified as top secret. Only 3 cardinals had access to the original content. One suffered a nervous breakdown after reading it. Another immediately requested a release from his duties. The third burned his own copy and never spoke of the matter again. For decades, the letter remained locked in the Vatican's secret archives, until 1982, when Kolbe was canonized. Something bizarre happened. On the day of the canonization, Pope John Paul II received an unexpected visitor. It was Francis Gajowniczek, the man whose life Kolbe had saved. Now 81 years old, Gajowniczek requested a private audience with the Pope. He said he had something urgent to reveal about Kolbe. The audience lasted 3 hours. When Gajowniczek left the meeting, he was visibly shaken. Reporters tried to interview him, but he refused to speak. He only whispered one sentence before disappearing forever: "Some saints pay a price that not even God should demand." 3 weeks later, John Paul II did something unprecedented in the history of the Church. He ordered that the secret archives related to Kolbe be opened. All of them, including the last letter. What was written in that letter was so disturbing that it changed how the Church itself understands the concept of sanctity. Kolbe hadn't written a prayer. He hadn't written words of forgiveness or unconditional love. He had written an accusation against God. But it wasn't an ordinary accusation. It was something much deeper, more terrifying. Kolbe had discovered something during his final days of agony. Something about the nature of human suffering, about the role God really plays when we allow evil to happen. And he was horrified. The letter began with a simple question. If the suffering of the innocent is part of your divine plan, then who exactly is the true enemy of humanity? But that was only the first line. What came next was a theological analysis so brutal, so devastating, that it questioned the very foundations of the Christian faith. Kolbe had come to a terrible conclusion. What if God wasn't who we thought he was? What if the entire structure of religion was a way to keep us blind to a much more disturbing truth? The letter continued for 12 handwritten pages. Each line was a theological bomb that exploded centuries of dogma. On the second page, Kolbe questioned the nature of miracles. I saw children praying with pure faith being executed. I saw murderers spared by chance. If God chooses whom to save, then his criteria are incomprehensible to any human definition of justice. On the third page, he attacked the concept of divine trial. They say God tests us to strengthen us. But what kind of father tortures his children to prove his love? What kind of love demands suffering to validate itself? On the fourth page, he questioned the very nature of prayer. I prayed for 3 months straight. Millions pray every day. If God listens, why does he choose silence? If he doesn't listen, why do we pretend he does? But it was on the 6th page that Kolbe wrote something that still makes theologians lose sleep. What if the God we worship is merely a human creation to justify our own cruelty? What if we invented a God who allows suffering because we cannot accept that we are the only ones responsible for it? On the 8th page, He arrived at the theory he called the Great Inversion. I observed the Nazis praying before executions. I saw torturers making the sign of the cross after killing children. They all invoke the same God. They all believe they are fulfilling his will. How is this possible unless God is fundamentally different from what we imagine? Kolbe had discovered something in the starvation bunker, something he described in terrifying detail. On the 10th day of fasting, when the line between life and death became invisible, I had a revelation. I've seen all the horrors of human history, crusades, inquisitions, genocides, all done in God's name. And I realized they weren't aberrations. They were the true face of the divinity we created. God is not unconditional love. God is a reflection of our own capacity to justify any atrocity, as long as we can blame a higher power. The Nazis are no different from the Crusaders. I am no different from them. We all serve the same master. Our need to believe our cruelty has a divine purpose. According to his theory, everything humanity believed about God and the devil was precisely the opposite. The miracles were, in fact, distractions. The trials were the only way God genuinely revealed himself. And the suffering of the innocent, it wasn't a test of faith. It was God trying to show us his true face. The face we spent 2,000 years refusing to see. Kolbe wrote that during his final days, he had a final vision. It wasn't Mary appearing to him. It was a figure he couldn't clearly identify. A presence that radiated light, but a cold light, distant. And this presence had shown him something. It had shown him the real reason why certain people are chosen to suffer. It's not punishment. It's not a test. It's not purification. It's because these people are too close to the truth. And the truth, as Kolbe discovered, is that God is not unconditional love. God is fear. Fear that humanity will discover it doesn't need him. The letter ended with a statement that still keeps Vatican theologians up at night. If I am right, then all of us who dedicate our lives to serving him are in fact serving our own executioner. And he lets us suffer, not because he loves us, but because he fears what would happen if we stop believing we deserve this suffering. Kolbe signed the letter with his full name, and underneath, a single word in Latin, veritas, truth. The letter was never answered, not because no one at the Vatican read it, but because no one could find an answer that wouldn't destroy the entire structure of the Catholic faith. For 40 years, the Church tried to refute Kolbe's arguments. They summoned the greatest theologians in the world. They organized secret committees of doctrinal studies. None could prove Kolbe wrong. Worse, some began to find evidence that he might be right, in ancient documents, in accounts of other saints who had been censored, in apocryphal texts that the Church had buried centuries ago. A pattern began to emerge. Whenever someone got too close to God, genuinely close, two things happened. First, that person began to question everything they had learned about divinity. Second, that person began to suffer in inexplicable ways, as if the very act of seeking the truth about God was punished. And here we arrive at the real reason why Kolbe's letter was never answered. It's not because the Church didn't want to answer. It's because the Church realized that any answer would be a confession. A confession that Kolbe may have discovered something humanity wasn't ready to know. Something that would completely change our relationship with the divine. Something that would force us to face a terrifying question. What if faith, instead of liberating us, was the prison itself? What if God wasn't our savior, but our jailer? What if everything we call divine will was in fact a system of control so sophisticated that it convinced us to love our own chains? Kolbe died believing he had discovered the most dangerous truth in human history. A truth so disturbing that even God prefers it to remain buried. But what if he was right? What if the only way to truly find God was to stop looking for him? What if the only way to be free was to accept that maybe, just maybe, We were never destined to be saved. These are the questions born from that unanswered letter, questions that echo through the corridors of the Vatican to this day, questions that make cardinals wake up in the middle of the night, sweating, because deep down they all know that Maximilian Kolbe died, knowing something they spend their entire lives trying not to discover, the truth about who really rules this world and why he never, ever answers when we need him most. The letter exists. It's kept in the Vatican's ultra-secret archives, catalogued as heretical document alpha level. Only the Pope has access to it. And every pope who has read it has made the same decision as their predecessors: absolute silence. Because some truths are too dangerous to be known, even if they were discovered by a saint, especially because they were discovered by a saint. But wait, take a deep breath, feel the air entering your lungs, because everything I've just told you is only half the story, and the other half completely changes what you've just heard. In 2005, 23 years after Kolbe's canonization, something extraordinary happened. Francis Gajowniczek, the man Kolbe saved, died at the age of 94. The week before his death, he did something that surprised his family. He called his grandson, handed him a sealed letter, and said, "Only open this after I die. And when you open it, publish the contents. The world needs to know." The grandson obeyed. Gajowniczek's letter revealed something that would forever change how we understand Kolbe's story. Gajowniczek had never told the truth about what really happened in that bunker. He had lied. For 64 years, the truth was this: Gajowniczek wasn't randomly chosen to die. He was chosen because he was a Gestapo informant. The Nazis discovered he was passing information about escape attempts. Several people had died because of his betrayals. The execution was, in fact, a disguised punishment. Kolbe knew this. In the days before, other prisoners had discovered Gajowniczek's treachery. They planned to kill him with their own hands. When Kolbe offered to die in his place, he wasn't saving an innocent man. He was saving a traitor. Someone who had caused the death of innocent people, and Kolbe knew exactly who he was. The question that haunted Gajowniczek for the rest of his life was simple: why? Why would a saint choose to die for someone who didn't deserve salvation? Why would Kolbe sacrifice his life to protect a man who had betrayed so many others? The answer was in Kolbe's original letter, in the part that was never released. Because the church didn't tell the whole truth about the letter's contents. Yes, Kolbe had questioned God. Yes, he'd leveled devastating accusations against the divine nature, but there was more to the letter, something the church considered even more dangerous than theological heresies. On the final page, Kolbe had written about a final revelation, an understanding that came to him in his last hours. He wrote, "I understood, finally understood why I chose to die for Gajowniczek. It wasn't compassion, it wasn't holiness, it was pure selfishness. I wanted to prove to God that I was better than him, that I could love unconditionally when he couldn't, that I could forgive when he chose to punish. But in those final moments, I saw the trap. God wasn't testing my faith, he was showing me my arrogance. I thought I could be holier than the holy, more compassionate than compassion itself, and it was this arrogance that brought me here. I didn't die a martyr. I died a man who discovered that his goodness was merely disguised pride. And if this is true for me, who dedicated my entire life to service, what does it mean for everyone else who believes themselves to be good?" Kolbe had uncovered something terrifying about human nature. That even our noblest actions can spring from the darkest motives, that the line between holiness and arrogance is thinner than we imagine, that perhaps true holiness is accepting that we will never truly be saints. But the letter continued, and what came next was even more disturbing. In my final hours, I had a vision. I saw Gajowniczek 40 years in the future. I saw him carrying the weight of my death like a curse. I saw that my sacrifice wouldn't save him. It would only condemn him to eternal guilt, to live knowing that a better man died for his betrayals. And then I understood. I wasn't saving Gajowniczek. I was condemning him to the worst possible fate for a human being, to live with an impossible debt to repay. Perhaps this is the true face of evil, not the obvious cruelty of the Nazis, but the kindness that disguises itself as salvation when in truth it is condemnation. I saved him from death, but I condemned him to something worse than death, to live forever knowing he didn't deserve to be alive. Gajowniczek confirmed this prophecy in his posthumous letter. For 64 years, he lived in a psychological hell that no physical torture could match. He couldn't sleep. Every night, he saw Kolbe's face in those final moments. He heard the saint's voice whispering, "I die for you." He couldn't eat without remembering that Kolbe had starved to death. Every bite was a betrayal. Every day of life was an affront to the memory of the man who died in his place. He couldn't hug his children without thinking, Kolbe will never be able to hug anyone again. He couldn't forgive himself. How could he forgive himself for being alive when a saint was dead? He attempted suicide 17 times. The first was 2 weeks after the liberation of Auschwitz. He took rat poison. He woke up in the hospital 3 days later. Doctors said it was impossible for anyone to survive that dose. The second was jumping off a bridge. The rope that should have snapped his neck broke. He survived with minor injuries. The third, fourth, fifth, something always prevented his death. A defect in the weapon, a miraculous last-second medical intervention, an impossible coincidence, as if an invisible force prevented him from escaping his prison of guilt. Kolbe didn't save me, Gajowniczek wrote in his final letter. He condemned me to the worst possible fate for a human being, to live knowing I don't deserve to be alive. Every day is torture. Every person who calls me a survivor is a stab. Every time someone says I'm lucky to be alive, I want to scream, "A saint died so that a traitor like me could breathe." I tried to live a worthy life. I tried to honor his sacrifice. But how can a man honor something he doesn't understand? How can I honor a saint when I know he died for someone who betrayed others? I spent 64 years trying to understand why Kolbe did that, why he chose to die for me specifically, and only now, at 94, have I finally understood. He didn't die to save me. He died to teach me that salvation and condemnation are the same thing, that being chosen to live can be much worse than being chosen to die, that sometimes the greatest act of love is also the greatest act of cruelty. He wrote, "Kolbe didn't save me. He cursed me. He condemned me to live carrying his holiness like a stone in my chest. And the worst part is that I know he knew exactly what he was doing. He died a saint in the eyes of the world, but I lived a demon in my own eyes. And now I understand that perhaps that was his true intention, to prove that even the greatest kindness can be the greatest cruelty. But here we get to the heart of the matter, to the real reason why Kolbe's letter was never answered. It's not because his theories about God were dangerous. It's because his theories about human nature were too accurate. Kolbe had discovered that there is no pure goodness, that every noble action carries within it the seed of its own corruption, that even saints are driven by motivations they prefer not to examine too closely. And if this is true, then what does it say about the entire moral structure of humanity? What does it say about our heroes, our spiritual leaders, our own altruistic actions? The Church never answered Kolbe's letter because there is no answer that doesn't destroy the illusion necessary for society to function. The illusion that good and evil are clearly distinguishable. The illusion that we can trust the motivations behind our noblest actions. The illusion that holiness is something real and not just extremely well-disguised arrogance. But there's more. In 2019, something extraordinary happened. Pope Francis, following a tradition dating back to John Paul II, read Kolbe's original letter. His reaction was unlike all his predecessors. Instead of horror or perturbation, Francis smiled. And then he did something unprecedented in papal history. He wrote a response to the letter that had gone unanswered for 78 years. The Pope's response was classified as ultra-secret, but leaks indicate that Francis wrote only one line. "My dear Kolbe, you finally understood. The question was never about God, it was about you, and it wasn't meant to be answered. It was meant to be lived." What Father Kolbe was saying is that he discovered the deepest truth about the human condition, that our questions about God are always, at their core, questions about ourselves, that our suffering doesn't exist to be explained, but to be experienced, that the search for answers is often just a way to avoid accepting the fundamental mystery of existence. Kolbe spent his whole life searching for God outside of himself. In the end, he discovered that God was where he least wanted to look, in his own contradictions, in his own shadows, in his own infinite capacity to be simultaneously saint and sinner. The letter was never answered, because the question was wrong from the start. Kolbe asked, "Why has God abandoned me?" The answer was, God never abandoned you. You abandoned yourself by trying to be perfect. The silence that followed the letter wasn't divine abandonment. It was divine compassion. It was God respecting the human process of discovering that sanctity isn't about having all the answers. It's about accepting that some questions are more important than their answers, that some mysteries are more sacred when they remain mysteries, that maybe, just maybe, the real miracle isn't understanding God, but accepting that we will never fully understand ourselves. Maximilian Kolbe died believing he had been abandoned by God. In truth, he had been embraced by a truth larger than his own comprehension. He had discovered that sanctity isn't perfection. It's the courage to face our own imperfection without trying to hide it behind divine justifications. It's not having all the answers. It's living fully within the questions, accepting that some questions are more sacred than any answer. It's not never doubting. It's doubting and choosing to love anyway. It's questioning God and still dedicating your life to serving Him. It's discovering that true faith doesn't need certainties. It only needs courage. Kolbe spent his whole life searching for a perfect God, all-powerful, who would explain all the suffering in the world. What he found was far more terrifying and far more beautiful. He found a God who suffers alongside humanity, who questions his own decisions, who carries the weight of having created beings capable of such cruelty and such goodness. A God who doesn't have all the answers because he lives the same questions as we do. A God who doesn't prevent suffering because he himself is suffering. A God who doesn't answer our prayers because he himself is praying that we find the strength to endure what he cannot change. The letter was never answered because it was, in itself, the answer. The answer to a question humanity has been asking for millennia. How do we find God amidst suffering? The answer is simple and terrifying. By stopping searching for him in the places where he should be, in miracles, in blessings, in victories, and starting to look in the places where he should never be, in doubts, in failures, in contradictions, in the moments when our faith shatters and we are forced to recount everything from scratch. Kolbe found God exactly where he least expected, in the very absence of God, in the silence that followed his prayers, in the coldness he felt when he most needed warmth, in the abandonment he experienced when he most needed presence. Because it is there, in that apparent emptiness, that we discover something revolutionary. God is not separate from us. He is a part of us. He suffers in us. He questions through us. He loves despite us. And perhaps this is the only way to truly find him. Not through certainty, but through the courage to question even our most sacred questions. Not through perfect sanctity, but through the imperfect humility of recognizing that we are made of light and shadow, and that both are sacred, not through answers that reassure us, but through questions that transform us into more complete, more honest, and more real human beings. The letter exists. It's at the Vatican. It was never answered. And now you know why. Because some letters don't need an answer. They are the answer to questions we didn't know we were asking, about truths we didn't know we needed to discover, about a God we find precisely when we stop looking for him.